I was asked to introduce myself, so my name is kritya-2014. I'm from Iceland, and I am a human being. On October 28, 1953, an organization called Cinema 16 held 2 sessions of a symposium with the following artists: Maya Deren, Parker Tyler, Dylan Thomas, and Arthur Miller. This symposium was called Poetry and the Film. And what they wanted to do was to find out if there was a suitable way, or if it was even desirable, to make something called a poetic film, or if films in as such can be thought of as being poetic. And early in this symposium, the filmmaker, a lady called Maya Deren, she says, well, what we should maybe do before we address this question about poetry and the film, maybe we should first settle the issue of what is poetry. And it so happened that she had a theory of that, and the theory is quite interesting. She said that she thought that a narrative is either horizontal or vertical, and she talked about drama as being horizontal. Drama is something that moves a storyline or a plot forward. And then she says poetry is what she called a vertical movement, where the writer stops or pauses to describe an atmosphere or describe a moment, to describe a feeling or a thought. And I thought, yeah, you can. I'm reciting this by memory, but you can look it up. There's a recording of this on the internet. So you can find it on YouTube, Poetry and the Film. On this panel was also Dylan Thomas, who at the time was considered the greatest living poet in the English language. It was recorded on October 28th, 1953, and this is only 4 or 5 days before he went into a coma, and 6 days after going into a coma, he passed away. I'm thinking it could be the last recording of his voice, but it must be. On the day before, he had held on October 27th, he had held his 39th birthday. After Maya Deren had given this inspirational talk about the definition of poetry, he was asked to reply, seeing as he was considered this great poet. And he took the microphone. He said, well, I haven't a theory to my back, but I really like all this talk about horizontal movement and vertical movement. It sounds very nice, and if I had a theory, it would probably sound exactly like that of Maya Deren. So, I mean, what he means is, do we really need a definition of poetry? Maybe not. I mean, for most of us, we know it when we see it. When we see something and it's good, we know, okay, this is poetry. But maybe we don't know exactly why. And even this excellent definition from Maya Deren, it doesn't really tell us why. But it still makes us stop, it makes us pause and think. So in that sense, that might be horizontal. I haven't got much time. Okay, so I have also another thought about it. This is not my own theory. An Indian poet that resides in America called Ralph Nazareth, he once talked to me about writing poetry, and he said everybody can write. Everybody can write poetry. He said 97% of what it takes is being human. This is why I introduced myself as being a human being. 1 or 2% is discipline. You have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. And maybe 1% is what is called talent or insight. Not many have that, and maybe that's what separates like the really great poet from other poets. But essentially, everybody has human experience. So, I mean, this is what we mediate. And I think we can combine these two theories from the Symposium on Poetry and Film and from Ralph Nazareth and say, poetry basically, when we write poetry, we are painting human experience. When we read poetry, we are absorbing that experience, and that way we relate to one another. So lastly, before lunch, I was talking to one of the reporters here, Artsena Ravi, and it was a similar discussion, and we were talking about, so how do I express a feeling? How do I put into word a feeling that I have so that you understand what that feeling is about? And she asked, for instance, let's say I have a headache. How can I explain this to you? And I thought, yeah, this is a great example. Maybe I haven't had a headache in my life, or even if I had, how can I know that my headache is the same as yours? How can you explain to me? Let's say you meet me and I've never had a headache, and I can see something is wrong, and I said, Artsena, what's wrong? And you said, I don't feel well, I have a headache. And I said, oh, I heard about it, but what is it like? You must tell me, what is this feeling like? Well, have you ever injured yourself in elbow or knee, or have you ever felt pain? I said, no, not really. Toothache, you must have had a toothache. No, I really take care of my teeth. So I don't know, what kind of ache is it? And we were using this dialogue to express how difficult it might be. And then I suggested, what about then if you say to me, have you had your heart broken? And I said, yeah. That I know. Well, maybe that's like an extreme case of a headache. Maybe a headache is, more mild, but it's a feeling. We know it when we experience it, but not always can we mediate it. But that's what we try with poetry. Thank you.
Just a few words about Christian Gutterson. He is the author of 9 poetry books in Icelandic, published his first book in 1995. He lives in eastern Iceland with his wife and children. He is a junior college teacher of ethics and creative writing and is currently studying philosophy at the University of Iceland. Next we have Kamal Vora.
Good afternoon. Every poet, for that matter, every reader has a theory about poetry. No one theory is exclusively true. So I'll put before you what poetry means to me. Although a poem arises when there is nothing else to be done, although a poem is a last attempt at order when one can't stand disorder any longer, although poets are most needed when freedom, vitamin C, communications, laws and hypertension therapy are also most needed. Although to be an artist is to fail, and art is fidelity to failure, as Samuel Beckett says, a poem is not one of the last, but one of the first things of men. With this quote from by Czech poet Holub, I begin my talk on what poetry means to me. I have titled it Poetry, Timeless Moments. I do not write poetry to explore my inner self, but to seek confrontation with poetic truths. Such confrontations compel me to gather the fragments of my being, make me whole, and place me before pure poetry. These are moments with no illusion of duality, moments of pure solitude. In these moments, ephemeral of course, intentions and temptations are chiseled away, revealing the shapes of poetic truth. The rapture I feel is timeless. Life disrupts solitude. Poetry structures it and reclaims it. Life often makes me forget this solitude. Poetry recalls and reconnects with its bliss. This solitude is quite different from the Western notion of the despairing alienation of outsiders and celebrates wholeness. This wholeness, this non duality, this rapture, this experience of timelessness in time is all I seek from poetry. Each one of us has a unique reality. Each reality is defined by its time and space. However, these realities are affected by other times and other spaces. Our heritage too shapes our reality. I do not seek a divorce from my reality, but I seek to transform it through my sensibility into a poetic reality. If life has anything to do with poetry, it is this. The reality of space and time and poetic reality both are governed by different laws. Even though poetic reality is begotten from the reality of space-time, it is equally real, perhaps as much real as this world where we breathe. In my poetry, I attempt to erase the relationship between the two realities, to uncover pure poetry. Though poetry is not a magical key to open the door of life, though it offers only moments of transient rapture, the driving force of my relentless struggle is the splendid solitude that challenges me to seek poetic truth again and again. One path of poetry is expression of experience. It is easy to recognize the poet's space-time reality in such poems. Poems are easy to enter into, to identify with. These poems recall and reunite us with our own experiences, real or imagined. Another path of poetry internalizes experience. It is possible to exclude inherited and experienced contexts here. This poetry is deceptively simple, its language nimble, single-minded, uncluttered. It conceals more than it reveals, evokes more than it says. This is not to say that any one path is better than the other, but my poetry does not seek to recreate what once was. It seeks to create what never was. I prefer poetry that gently guides me into the new experience unfolding before me. It's not easy to describe how my creative process begins. It is triggered by many time-space simultaneously. I shun meter, rhyme, metaphor, myths, traditions, and inherited truths. I also refuse to be drawn into debates of modern or postmodern poetry. I believe such descriptions come into existence after poetry is written. Even though each poet is the product of his space-time reality, no poem is obliged to reflect it directly. No poem could be dictated by descriptors or space-time. I believe in writing poetry free from such concerns. I end with the last lines of the same Holub poem. I quote, "But in its aimlessness, in its desperate commitment to the word, a poem remains the most general guarantee that we can still do something, against emptiness, that we haven't given in, but are giving ourselves to something, that we are not composed only of facts." Provided a poem, which is the poet's modest attempt to pull off disintegration for a while, is not regarded as the philosopher's stone, bringing salvation and deliverance to stupefied mankind. For art doesn't solve problems, but only wears them out. For art is fidelity to failure, for a poem is when there is nothing else remains. What a pretty paradox. Poetry has no function, and yet, as long as one person writes a poem or one person reads it, there is hope. That is what makes poetry essential. Thank you so much.
Kamal Vora is an engineer and management graduate by qualification. He is engaged in the family business of pharmaceutical distribution. His poems started appearing in the leading and prestigious magazines of Gujarati from 1971. He is also a short story writer. His two published books of poems are titled Arav and Anek, and third one is due for publication by the end of 2014. Arav was a recipient of the Uma Shankar Joshi Award. His poems have been translated in English and appeared in Indian Literature, Chicago Review, Anthology of Asian Poets, Muse India, etc. A few translations in Hindi, Marathi, Bengali and Kannada have also been published. He participated in Dubai International Poetry Festival in 2009 and World Poetry Festival 2014 Sabbath, organized by Sahitya Academy in New Delhi. Since 2010, he edits with Naushil Mehta, a prestigious quarterly journal, Ethard, founded by late Suresh Joshi. He is also a member of the Gujarati Advisory Board of Sahitya Academy, and he lives in Mumbai. Now, next person I invite Tuva Forstom from Finland. So, Seth Michelson from US.
Hello, everybody. It's a joy to be here. Thank you, Rati, for organizing this. Thank you, everyone else behind the scenes working to make it possible. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to speak very briefly. I translated some sort of a selected of Rati's poems into English, and so I wanted to just talk a little bit today about translation. First, as you've heard from every poet so far this morning, the joy of hearing Malayalam poems after Latvian poems or after hearing in German or in English is an enormous pleasure and a responsibility. And that's sort of what I'm talking about today. And I just want to propose the notion that translation is always already in process in poetry writing, whether monolingual poetry or otherwise. And as we bring these poems to the public, and I'll read just three of these in a moment, it's the idea that we're always already hybrid, right? Poetry is creating community. Like when we heard the poems come from Malayalam after hearing in German or English, it creates community, right? It's not that poetry is impossible to translate. That's just the lack of, it's cognitive egocentricity, right? It's a lack of imagination of the speaker pronouncing that claim, right? That it can't be translated. It's saying that maybe I foreclose the possibility for myself, but I would never want to foreclose it for other people, right? So poetry is instead, in its translation, right, a mode of possibility, a way of emerging, a way of coming into presence, right? And it's coming into presence through linguistic hybridity as well as other forms, social and economic and culture, for example. And it's making present new forms of discursivity, right? So it's a very important process. And I'm going to share a couple of poems from Rati that exemplify this. So here's one. This is a title poem of the book. It's called Dreaming in Another Land. He wanted her to smile, the dream of living in another land. He wanted her to dance like a melody on a violin's strings. He wanted to see in her lap the milk-stained mouth of a sleeping child. He looked after her like day-old bread to be relished. He was trying to save her from the barbed wire around Albania or Siberia that bloomed like flowers from stone. He loved her more than his country, but lost her far away, like his dream, the same as a young man of his enemy country, right? So this is this artificial division that we see, right? That's foreclosing possibility. And when we hear the poems together and we don't understand the Malayalam, I didn't understand the Malayalam, or if you don't understand the German or the Latvian or the English, it forces connections, right? It compels us to create new communities, new solidarities, new networks of being, right? That are conditioned discursively, they're conditioned through language, right? Which is a real beauty of the possibility of emerging through these networks of speaking, right? And here's another one from Rati that exemplifies this. Mama Rati, Dr. Rati. This one's called Time Near to Me. Today I woke late and ignored my cup of tea, reading an unknown poet from Lithuania. His poems were open like a glass jar, and my words began to fill the gaps between them. Today I ignored the dirty dishes in the sink, didn't bother to fold the washed clothes. I turned on the TV, flipped channels, and let my room fill with many voices. When words took flight from my fingertips on the keyboard, birthing a poem by computer, that movement, time, wandered around me like my tame dog. Right? So this is one way of thinking even more deeply about the structure of translational possibility. It's always being a process in motion, right? Of combining, hybridizing, realizing the intrinsic hybridities of who we are through language, even if we're monolingual poets, right? How language is always shifting and censoring and erasing itself, right? And gaining new aspects, integrating the other. So it's an approach at articulation that's always impossible, but always the possibility of impossibility, right? That's adequate. Here's one more beautiful little poem by Rati. And it's about the possibility of language. It's called A Faithful Prayer. Deep love cannot surface during faithful prayer. It's a sin to think of love while praying. But prayer within love, that's the greatest virtue. So here's the book, if you're interested in seeing it in English. Rati's going to come up here to talk about it now. Oh, and I'm going to stay here. Thank you for listening.
This is very interesting incident in the field of translation. I don't know it happened before or not. Seth does not know Hindi, and he has translated my poetry from Hindi. And how it is possible, it itself is very strange for me. When I was invited in Marymount University by Alicia Patnoy to US Los Angeles, Seth was there to present my poetry. And I found that Seth was understanding my philosophical points which were taken from the Vedic philosophy based. And which was very strange because I never saw Europeans or American understanding those Vedic like death and the rebirth and all these things he could understood well. Then it was very interesting the way he translated. I said that if you read my poetry if you can understand my poetry in English and you can translate my poetry in English, it will be good. So what he used to do that we used to talk in Skype. I used to read in Hindi. He used to tape my Hindi, and then he used to ask the words in English. So he was taking care of rhyme, rhythm, language, and then few words he used to ask me when whatever I give explanation. I never translate and give him. I was just giving him explanation. I used to explain in whatever I could explain the poetry. It was very strange that when the translation came, I did not feel that the translation is done by the person who has not learned Hindi at all. It is very close to Hindi, extremely close to Hindi. So that itself shows that how poetry connect, and that is why he said dreaming in another land, and that's what he has written here. He was dreaming in India. So thank you, Seth. If you want to know that how a person can translate without knowing a language, you can get the book from here. So thanks a lot, Seth.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rati.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Said Michelson is the author of poetry collections House in a Hurricane, Big Table, Kaddish for My Unborn Son, Pudding House. Those those are the publishers, Maestro of Brutal Splendor, and his latest book, Eyes Like Broke Windows, won the poetry category of the 2013 International Book Awards. His translation of El Ghetto Sudamericana by the internationally acclaimed Argentine poet Tamara Kamensein appears as the Ghetto Point of Contact. His translation of Bicho Bola by the Uruguayan poet Victoria Estol appears as Roly Poly. So he has a lot of translations to his credit. He holds an MFA in poetry and a PhD in comparative literature and teaches the literature of the Americas in the Department of Romance Languages at Washington and Lee University in the United States. His scholarship appears internationally in a variety of venues. He'll be finishing his 2 academic books, The Poetics of Re-Emergence, Poetry, Subjectivity, Political Violence in the Neoliberal Age, and Decaptivating Bodies, Prison, Politics, and Literary Production soon. We have one more participant in this session, Augusta La. I invite her to speak on poetry and poets.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much, Rati, Saxena, for this beautiful invitation. I'm talking about the Shamrock Festival of Women Poets. So far, what I know, the only worldwide festival for women poets. If everyone knows another one, he can tell me. Maybe in Papua New Guinea or something. When I was performing as a poet for several years, I realized that conditions for women poets are quite different than conditions for male poets. And there is, as everybody knows, there's less publishing, less prices, and less possibilities for performances. And not only me, but other poets got angry too. And I decided that anger is a form of creative, positive energy. And I decided to found a salon where women can perform and are able to communicate, and also where we can discuss the conditions of writing for women. It all started with the name of Shamrock. It started with a poem, Shamrock. Das Gezirre zieht, zieht, das Geflirre ziert, ziert, das Gezische fischt, fischt, das Geziehe flieht, flieht, das Gezirpe führt, führt, das Nina, Nina, nie, was die Scham rockt. The name Shamrock, it comes from 2 words. Scham in German is the word shame in English. It's one of the basic feelings of women. And rock is the basic cloth for women. It's frock. And also it's rock and roll. So the word shamrock is also initiating the liberation of shame. In 2009, the first Shamrock Salon was going on stage, and I had several years the salon, and when I was told by public cultural institutions that they wanted to cut down my the financial support, I decided to get bigger and founded the Shamrock Festival. And the first Shamrock Festival was in 2012 with almost 50 poets from mostly German-speaking countries, but also German language-based poets like Ruth Klüger from USA. She was performing in 2012. Also her first poems she made in Auschwitz because she was an Auschwitz survivor. She's now 84, and for her, poetry was life-saving because she was reciting and writing poetry as a girl. And these poems, and also new ones, she was reciting at the first Shamrock Festival. Also, Friederike Mayröcker, now 90 years old, was a supporter and sent us greetings and poems. And she said, if I make it a second time, she will come and read. And therefore, I did the festival in Vienna too. It was this year. And Friederike Mayröcker was coming and she was reading. It was a great success. And the second Shamrock Festival in October 2014 was with nearly 60 poets from 13 countries, also with translation projects, poets from Ireland, Finland, Turkey, Slovenia, Galicia, Tuva.
Let me just walk you through to that you get an impression. It was not only poetry like reading with a glass next to you, but there were lots of performances, concerts going on. Here were some participants, among them the mayor of Munich, who for the first time suggested that it's like a major cultural event of our town, which made us really proud. We had people from the spoken arts movement and slam poetry movement, a staged opera with words by a very famous German poet, and Ruth Gomringer, who you see here. People presenting poets at the same time, so you wouldn't have not only readings but also like a comment from the poet occasionally to that. And there were various country slots, so to speak. So there were people coming from Ireland with a special translation project, from Turkey, from the Galician part of Spain, and here we have, for instance, Anja Golob, a fantastic poet from Slovenia. People that we never met before and discovered. Dacia Maraini, very famous writer from Italy, and which made us, and especially Augusta, but me also very proud. You see back down there, some of you might remember the rock days in Germany, the krautrock movement. This was the singer of Amandül II. She's now about 65 years old, but she's very a legend in her own. And there were people coming from the US, from Japan, we had hip hop from Turkey, and from Tuva, Sanko Namcilak joined us as well.
And this shows the combining force of being together and showing, presenting, performing poetry. And there's Friederike Mayröcker.
The festival took part in Munich as well as in Vienna, because Friederike Mayröcker actually wrote a poem for Augusta, inviting her to do the festival in Vienna. And it was her 90th birthday that we were celebrating there at the same time in the Literaturhaus in Vienna, together with the Vienna Poetry School.
And it was another famous writer, Marlene Strerowitz, who gave me the advice, stay with your anger. We did another festival this year. It was the Shamrock Film Festival, showing movies about poets. Also a movie about Ruth Klüger, also about Friederike Mayröcker and Riot Girls, because Riot Girls and female poets, they have many things together in common. And I would like to invite Rati Saxena for 2016 to join us in Munich for the next festival.